Good afternoon and welcome to this evidence session for the Independent Committee on Standards in Public Life. The Committee on Standards in Public Life advises the Prime Minister and the government of the day on processes and procedures around ethical standards across all of public life in the UK. And this afternoon, we're very pleased to have with us Jacqui McKinlay, who is the Chief Executive of the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, and also Jonathan Goolden, a partner with Wilkin Chapman with a particular specialism in the areas that we'll be discussing. You will be aware that we are broadcasting this on YouTube, so we are going to be available for live viewing and also after the event. And it's probably just worth saying that we will not be talking about individual cases, and particularly not any cases of litigation. 25 years ago, the Goolden Committee established the 7 Principles of Public Life, and since then we have seen a development of a variety of standards bodies looking at particular parts of our public life in this country. We commissioned some independent academic work to map that quite complex tapestry in 2019. And to follow that up, our current inquiry is looking to see how effective the overall system of standards regulation is in this country, to look for areas where there may need to be recommendations for improvement, and also to identify areas of best practice. So that's the inquiry that we're currently engaged on. I think without more ado, I will therefore invite our speakers to answer the questions from the committee. Committee represented today by several independent members, particularly Dame Shirley Pearce, Dr. Jane Martin and Monisha Shah, and one of our political members, Lord Stunnell, who represents the Liberal Democrats. So if I could start, before we go on to specifics, the wider question that I would like to invite you both to comment on is how important are ethical standards for good governance, and how confident are you that they are being generally upheld within the UK at present? And perhaps I could start with Jacqui McKinlay for that.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It's a real pleasure. I think from my organisation's perspective and my perspective, we see high ethical standards as being the bedrock for good governance. And I think it definitely comes in that order. I mean, we definitely view governance as being, the systems, the structures, the processes that an organisation operates by. And a lot of that, and I'm sure Jonathan, will have a view, can be seen as being about compliance. But our view is that good governance goes much further than that. It's about behaviours, it's about attitudes, and fundamentally it's about people. And where we do tend to see governance failures, very often the systems and the structures, not always, but are working well. But what we get is a culture where high ethical standards may not be maintained, people feel their voices are not heard, trust and confidence in the system is broken. So, for us, as you'd expect from an organisation with the title that we've got, definitely see it being as fundamental. I think on the question of whether they're being upheld, I've been in this role for 5, coming on for 6 years now. My sense is that we talk much more explicitly about high ethical standards than maybe we did even 5 or 6 years ago. And I think there's probably some reasons for that. We had the collapse of Carillion. We've seen some high profile examples where high ethical standards haven't been upheld. So my sense from particularly a local government point of view and public services point of view is we understand what they are, we understand the Nolan principles, we understand why they're important. I think the question that I'm sure we'll get into today is whether that's as widespread as it could be, particularly as the landscape has changed and delivery of public services has changed and the political environment has changed, and as we're seeing today, the digital world has changed. So I think there is that question of, do we have enough in place for them to be upheld, and do we have enough of a common language now across this very complex landscape that we're operating? I'll stop there.
Talking, if I can just follow up with one question before I go to Jonathan Goolden. Talking of, as it were, the common language, what definition do you use for governance within your work?
We definitely talk about it being the systems and relationships which support an organisation to run effectively, efficiently, and with clear accountability. I say that's the kind of broad definition that we talk about. And very recently, we've published some work which has 7 characteristics of good governance, because what we found was that definition is so broad. And as I said, you could just talk about it from a compliance point of view. But where we find that there has been either a crisis or, a breakdown or even really good practice, what we tend to describe it as being about the behaviours that happen. So the characteristics from a local government point of view we talk about are, understanding officer and member relationships, having clear forward plans, having good oversight and audit. So very much they're getting that mix of system and behaviours in there, but that common language of what does good and poor practice look like, I think that's where some of the challenges come in.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Goolden, do you want to come in on that question as to the importance of high ethical standards and whether they are currently generally being upheld in your view?
Indeed, yes. I think, first of all, I pose a question back. What do we mean by high ethical standards today? And it's something I'd like to come back to when I think you're going to ask us to comment on the applicability and relevance of the Nolan Principles. I think what we consider to be high ethical standards has moved somewhat since those principles were first set out. And I very much agree with what Jacqui has said, that I think there's more of a concentration on behaviours than there was perhaps when the principles were first set out. And I found it very helpful, and I think it's great value, the 7 characteristics of governance which Jacqui's centre has set out in a very recent report, which it's the Governance, Risk and Resilience Framework for the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, the 7 characteristics which Jacqui was referring to. And I noted, when it comes to officer and councillor roles, Jacqui, you have a box where you highlight negative behaviours. The authority may have an ethical or values framework, but an understanding of it is absent. People rely on rigid adherence to rules and checklists as a substitute for exercising responsible, personal and professional judgment of behaviours. And I think that exemplifies the difference, the distinction between rules and behaviours. And I think that life today is much about behaviours and culture. How important are high ethical standards? I think they're vital, and that's not just a trite comment. There is a key link between poor behaviours, poor ethical standards, and governance failure, leading to service failure. And your own committee gave several examples of that in the report in 2019 on local government ethical standards. Max Culler, for example, commented on governance failures, and you set out 3 indicators of governance risk, one of which was a culture of fear or bullying, which leads to, and I'm going to use the phrase, a loss of professional curiosity because alternative views are stifled. And I was also struck that I think that high ethical standards, we talk about that as being integrity. I was struck by a phrase which crops up in, again, a report undertaken by Jacqui's organisation, the Governance Review of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea post Grenfell. where it says behaving with integrity means following a set of principles that are seen as worthwhile by those you hope will trust you. And it's that last few words which I felt had particular resonance for me. High ethical standards is vital to trust, and the successful delivery of public services relies on trust.
Thank you very much. I'll just say that the audio quality is variable, but I think we are getting the pretty clear understanding of what you're saying, but there are just one or two words missing, so just by way of kind of observation. I'm going to hand over to Dame Shirley Pearce to move forward. Thank you.
Jonathan, Jacqui, thank you very much. As Lord Evans has said, the CSPL is the sort of guardian of the Nolan principles and the 7 principles of public life, which you've both been referring to. I wanted to get a sense from both of you, and I think Jonathan's alluded to some aspects of it, but are they still fit for purpose? Are they a sort of bedrock from which we can be working on now, or do they really need some sort of amending or additions? Jacqui, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, it's been interesting looking at them again in preparation for this session, because, you know, it's easy to think, yes, they must need updating. It's been 25 years and the world has changed so much. But actually, when you look at the words and you think what alternatives you put in place, or you'd think of how could you summarize, you know, some of the contextual challenges and the different world we live in, you know, I think they're good. I mean, you know, they've stood that test of time. I think they are well understood. You know, I've seen them applied in member training sessions, from a recruitment perspective, from a public sector. You know, they are still being used. It's not like we have to go and dust them off and, you know, I think they are still understood. I think, you know, a question is, do they apply equally across, you know, for better word, officer and member environment? And I think they do. I think if you apply that, you know, the democratic accountability that sits both at a national and a local level, and now much more at a regional level, I think that's the standard that we expect in the different component parts of it. I suppose questions then get into, you know, the context in which we're now operating. And as I referred to in the first question, I think one of the things that, you know, we may need to look at is it still feels like they're very applicable to public holders of some form of office. And I think, you know, as the world has changed so dramatically in relation to how public services are delivered, and I don't just mean from a let's outsource everything to Capita, but we've got a whole voluntary sector, very vibrant, different ways of delivering services, joint ventures, partnerships, you know, a really, really complex world. And I think that kind of pushing of the definition so it applies to anybody who's responsible for public spend or delivering public services, because I do think the way the world now operates, we expect that from everybody, and actually not everybody who's just delivering public services, you know, people who are handling our data, delivering our shopping, whatever it might be. So I think for me, really strong still set of you know, descriptors there. It is probably about how do we think about the world in which they're operating, and what do we need to do either to promote, explain, get them upheld in a much broader kind of environment.
Yeah. Okay. So interested in the member officer point that you make, because one of the suggestions that has been made to us is that the selflessness one is a bit tricky for people that are politically motivated and presenting themselves. So I wanted to, if you hadn't got any views about that. And then the other suggestion that we've had is that we should think about respect as an additional. Now I know you could go on adding all sorts of things, but what are your views?
You could. Yeah, I mean, I think selflessness depends on the definition, doesn't it? You know, I think anyone who goes into public service is there to do public good. They might think that there's different ways of doing that, different approaches to it, different philosophical background. But, you know, I think if, for me, selflessness is we are not there for personal gain, as in financial power, etc. You know, so I can see where there could be interpretation, but respect is a really interesting one, actually. And Jonathan mentioned the governance review that we did for Kensington and Chelsea, and we did work with community groups and citizens over what would governance principles look like in order to guide how the organisation worked in the future. And the word respect was what that came up more than anything. It wasn't hold more meetings of an evening, please, or, you know, let us have access to the papers earlier. It was treat us as equals, listen to us and respect what we are doing. Now, you know, it's interesting because it could be included there, but it's also one of the kind of applications of if you behave with integrity, selflessness, one of the outcomes is that you treat people with more respect. But yeah, as you say, you could have a long conversation about the different words that we could use there.
Yeah, but we could perhaps put more emphasis on that in the wording that goes behind the terms. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Jonathan, those questions to you, are the principles still fit for purpose in a world that's 25 years on, and the political tension issue and respect? What are your thoughts?
I think they've survived well and indeed have flourished in the sense that it is now usual to see those principles cropping up in statements of values or codes in a whole range of organisations, from policing to local government to the management and leadership of schools. But I do think they reflect, to an extent, the concerns of the late 1990s, where there was more of a focus on financial propriety, the expenses, homes for votes, and those were the concerns. There were a number of scandals of the time. I think that interpersonal behaviour, how we treat others, has become more of a currency of concern in the last few years, particularly the treatment of the abuse of power, where there is an imbalance in the relationship, whether that's workplace bullying or the Me Too movement. And for that, I would wish to see a more clear focus, reference to respect. Sometimes people look at the leadership principle and think that that encompasses respect, but actually principle 7, the leadership principle, merely is reflective of the other 6 principles. So I would wish the leadership principle to be modified slightly to include the concept of respect.
Thanks, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. I'll hand over now to Manisha. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Jacqui and Jonathan. I had a question for both of you, which perhaps I would ask Jonathan first. How would you establish an ethical culture in an organisation? What are the mechanisms that you might put into place to drive high ethical behaviour and standards, do you think?
I'm going to speak from my perspective, not simply from local government, but also as a compliance officer for legal practice and risk partner for a law firm. And I think there are several key elements. I think you need to remove or modify incentives to behaviour which is contrary to the organisation's desired ethos and values. So if you have a bonus skip system which tends to reward behaviours which say, are focused on personal billing targets, or in a financial institution, the taking of excessive risk. Those need to be addressed. So personal incentives need to be reframed to accord with the organisation's systems, ethos and values. Personal leadership is enormously important. You can't legislate for that, but you can reward it and develop it. That's the way we do things around here, is probably one of the most effective and powerful comments that could be made. Apparently, it only takes about 2 weeks for a new member of staff to become embedded in the prevailing culture. And Lord Evans has referred to Drucker's famous comment, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast," in your recent speech. I do think there's a need to have clear statements of ethical standards that do not, and those are the negatives, but also the positives, the values, behaviours and competencies. But it is also vital to cost failure. And one of the things which I in particular, I think, was able to do is to highlight to the managers and owners of where I work the cost of investigating, dealing with regulators, dealing with claims. Now, that poses a little bit of a problem in local government at the moment, in that there is no cost consequence for a town and parish council. The cost consequence of a breach of misconduct at town and parish level is visited on the district council, and that seems to be something which is difficult to deal with, but runs counter to the principle I've just set out. My final principle is that you should have a degree of protection for those you task with maintaining those standards, because it is by definition a relatively difficult job. I find it odd that I have more employment protection as a data protection officer in that role than I would do as a monitoring officer of a local authority. And that is a matter which you commented on, dealt with in the 2019 committee's report on local government.
Thank you. And if I may invite Jacqui to answer the same question.
Thank you. I will try and avoid repeating Jonathan, but just definitely to give support around protection for officers. And I think if you do look in the local government context, currently there's not a huge amount of protection for the monitoring officer, finance officer, chief executive in their statutory roles. It's a very obvious thing to say, but very often what we can see in organisations is that they expect high ethical standards to kind of embed themselves as if by magic across the organisation. And I think that's the point about it, very often seeing as a responsibility of the post holder. I am a public servant, I sign up, it's my responsibility to make sure these happen. And I think what we expect and would like to see, as Jonathan said, is a writ large from the point of recruitment, appointment, induction. This is both member and officers in a local government context, where that high ethical standard framework is explained, it's set out, good behaviour is explained, poor behaviour is explained, sanctions, escalation, so that whole kind of framework is there. And as Jonathan said, that's then kind of, demonstrated, role modelled, how actions are taken. But I think there's probably two other elements for me. Jonathan mentioned about the kind of system and process that you put in place make applying high ethical standards much more likely. So decisions not to apply high ethical standards are definitely going against the grain. And if I think about examples around decision making and risk, that is, meetings are held in public, clear evidence of what's informing decision making, transparent way that decisions are made, because again, where you see poor practice is decisions tend to not be made in public. They're made behind closed doors. In some cases, where you've got a dominant political group, they may be actually be made in group. And then this, the appearance is given of them going through a democratic process. We get cabinet meetings lasting 20 minutes, which, so there's just some examples there. I think the second element for me, as you might expect me to say, is that there's a real clear evidence of being open to scrutiny and being, welcoming and able to demonstrate how you're applying these standards, and not just applying, your own standards, marking your own homework. And where we've seen some examples of best practice, obviously we've got scrutiny committees that do that within local government, but we've seen that model being applied in some private sector organisations where they've set up scrutiny committees to, hold them to account for responsible business. That committee is able to report publicly, so you've got that dynamic there. So I think the whole body of leadership, I think, is right from top to bottom. But if you've got that extra element, which is we welcome scrutiny, we see it as being, a positive, helps us make better decisions, helps us uphold standards. I think that can really help, because you do get that extra bit of light shone on and get that move away from a groupthink, which can happen. And again, in organisations that fail, you tend to see it further reinforced.
And you talked about the obstacles to embedding high standards there, and the learning, from various types of practice. Do you have a particular example, Jacqui, of where establishing of an ethical culture has gone well?
Yeah, so if I could give two examples, and maybe a local government and a private sector one. So the work that Rotherham Council did post the child sexual exploitation crisis, David Louise Casey's report, all of the action that came there was very much led by the leader and the chief executive, wanting firstly to have a conversation with the community, but from that to set up a really clear set of, they called it values, but we could have easily called it ethical standards, which is, this is how we're going to work around here. We are going to listen to our residents, we are going to respect, we are going to operate integrity, we will respond to concerns. And that was then reinforced through action plans, through performance the whole kind of system then operated. And, sometimes out of that sort of level of crisis and adversity, it gives you a bit more of a blank sheet of paper to be able to reset. And I think they did that really well. We've also been working with ENGIE, the Energy and FM organisation, and post Carillion, I think they had good high ethical standards anyway, but they set up the Responsible Business Charter, which was their public declaration of how they were going to apply, in their case, standards across all aspects of business standards, environment, diversity, inclusion, how they work. And they set up a scrutiny board that we independently support, reports publicly. But I think what's really been interesting for that, one is it's seen as being a positive. It's not necessarily there to kind of shout at them and say what they haven't done, but they open themselves up, and also were very honest about where there are areas that they need to improve. So it wasn't just a kind of tick box showcase of everything that's great. So for example, when they were having some challenges around prompt payments, that was something that was very open, very, including the board in there. Same around statistics around diversity and inclusion. So I think probably two examples there and two elements of how organisations, I think, have approached it well.
Very good. Thank you very much. That's all from me, Chair. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. I think we're going to invite Lord Stunnell to ask some questions now.
Shall I come in first?
Oh, I do apologise. You're quite right.
Shall I come in first?
I've got that completely wrong. It is in fact Jane Martin. I do apologise.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, Jacqui and Jonathan. It's very nice to see you. I just want to pick up on the whole notion of leadership. You've both mentioned it anyway now. And of course, it's one of our principles, as you've also pointed out. And it's often cited as one of the important things for setting, promoting and upholding high standards. So I wonder if there's anything more you'd like to tell us about leadership. So how can we make leaders as effective as possible in supporting high ethical standards and dealing perhaps with difficult challenges? You know, any thoughts and examples on that in all the areas that you've been working in? Jacqui, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, I think, that we put on our leaders. And I think, you know, in every sector, the challenge of being a leader and decision maker has become even more difficult. And I think if you look across public services for the last, you know, decade, we're not now going into public service to make nice decisions about the colour of the swings in the park or a consultation over, you know, some great developments. Whilst that is happening, public service leaders are dealing with very challenging situations and cuts. I think, you know, what we see in local government is a number of elements which I think have worked well, but also there are improvements to be made. So what we have, particularly for statutory roles, is really strong membership bodies. And I think, you know, membership bodies around CSPL, Solace for chief executives, lawyers in local government, I think have come on leaps and bounds. You know, so we've got some really good kind of sector-led and sector bodies there which help with that role. And also, obviously, we've got the LGA and their improvement role that's there as well. I think it probably is, you know, and then you'll have all your informal networks that sit behind it. I think the challenge that we've now got, though, is that the pressures that are there and the complexity of the situation that people are dealing with is that, you know, crisis will happen. And I think what behaviour we tend to see when organisations are either managing, you know, weaknesses in government, service failures, you know, a tragedy and a crisis like Grenfell, is very often we can get more of an isolationist approach that happens, you know, where organisations tend to come in on themselves and we get the pressure that's there. I think what we also still see, in my view, is a bit of heroic leadership style, you know, where we'll bring in, and I can say it here, but, you know, a man of a certain age who will have all the answers to all the problems that we've got. And so I think what we are starting to see, and should see more of, is much more of a kind of open leadership style, where we know the problems that we've got are not going to be solved, and, you know, there are challenges there and very difficult political situations that we're asking people to be in. And then I think the final element is the protection element. I think from a public and a social media point of view, we know that people are a lot more vulnerable to how they're dealt with publicly. We know that, you know, there can be real challenges that people have to deal with in situations where they might not have the protection that we would like to give them in their statutory roles, but even more generally from a whistleblowing point of view. So, you know, I think being a leader, wonderful position, very challenging, good parts of the system, but also some parts of the system I think we do need to be looking at.
Okay, thank you. And Jonathan, your thoughts on this?
Jacqui's picked up on a few things that I was going to talk about, such as not getting unduly seduced by the concept of the leader as hero, and looking for an open leadership style. I think my point was that political leadership has never been more complex, personally demanding, and of course happens now in real-time scrutiny. You know, with an audience potentially of millions, as even humble parish councils have found. For me, the leader cannot make everything right, nor should be expected to do so. It's more about negotiating the trust for a framework to deal with crises and decisions. And a certain degree of consistency, I think, goes an awfully long way. Residents, voters, public realise that these are difficult decisions, and there will be winners and losers. But what they don't like, they really don't like, is where they perceive a decision to have been taken in one way, in one circumstance, and in a very different way, in a different organisational framework, and they wonder why that is. And not all of the consequences of breaching the local government code of conduct are highly dependent on the political circumstances of the council in the absence of an effective standards framework, sanctions framework. And that's something you focused on in the 2019 report. And I don't think that's wholly fair to councillors as much as to complainants, because one councillor may find that they are being encouraged to resign, whereas another councillor couldn't care tuppence, and that tends to be a product of what group they're in and the relative political dynamics of the organisation.
Jonathan, on that point, I just want to pick up. I mean, clearly there have been public concerns about central government, over recent months, maybe years. Some of these things have hit the headlines, and we're not going to go into those individual illustrations. But do you think, just speaking of leaders, and you've talked about consistency, and I know you're talking primarily across local government, but from the public point of view, they see politicians, and civil servants, working in a particular way. Do you think that when there's public concern about central government, that sort of affects the way other areas of government get perceived by the public? I mean, do you think it has an effect, basically, I'm asking? I mean, Jonathan, do you want to stick with that?
I do. I think it has a pretty immediate read across to the views held by the public, who tend not to make a huge distinction between different types of politicians, even though if you're a town and parish councillor, you see life in very different terms. You consider yourself to be a volunteer, an unpaid volunteer, acting for the good of the community. But you are treated as if you are the highest paid politician in the land. And so if there's a perceived failing at the top, all politicians perhaps get tarred with the same brush.
Yeah, well, yes. Jacqui, what's your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, as Jonathan said, it is immediate. I think there's probably two nuances to that. I think there is also something, which is the social media bubble of outrage that we can live in, and echo chamber, etc. And I think sometimes you do need to then further explore. I mean, I do think issues of trust have kind of been around for quite a long time now, so we're probably building up a good evidence bank for people to make a view on. But individual issues, I think you do need to sometimes be a bit more circumspect. I think from a local government point of view, what's quite interesting in the local government system is they do take quite a lot of pride on usually scoring higher trust scores than national government. So I think, Jonathan, you're right. The general public don't really, want to understand, and why should they? But I think within local government, they do usually pride themselves on having a better relationship and having, increased trust within that system. And what we tend to find as well is that, this lack of understanding of who does what and how much is actually centrally controlled. So, you may get a local issue around a school, and the first thing school's probably not a good example anymore, but, a local issue about a leisure centre, and the first thing people do is write to their MP. And which is however many layers, probably a voluntary community group that's running it, then to the council, etc. So I think it can be a bit more nuanced as you get into it. But the point I made earlier, I think we all have higher ethical standard expectations right across the board now. You know, I want Facebook to treat my data well. I want supermarket to, you know, have good payment standards for its employees. You know, I think our expectations right across the board have been, you know, have risen, and that applies even more so to people in public office.
And just sticking with Jacqui on this, just while you've got the conch, is it a question then for, you know, official leadership, as it were, a leadership, you know, chief executives or, you know, monitoring officers or whoever in the organisation? Is it a question really that their leadership is, I don't know, distinct from, more important than, I don't want to put words in your mouth, you know, their leadership is as important as the political leaders who we've been talking about? Because you've just been raising the point that there are higher expectations, I would call that, you know, of the public, local authorities, and we'll talk in a moment about private companies are delivering all of these things, and we want to ensure there are high standards. So is there anything that you would add about the role of not just, as I say, the leader, the chief exec, but leadership from the official side of the business, if I can put it that way?
Yeah, I mean, so the three kind of statutory officers often get called the golden triangle of, and I think, you know, their role in holding the governance framework up, you know, keeping it stable, managing it, mitigating risks across the different elements of finance, strategy, you know, legal. So I think there are those roles there. They are the people that tend to get, you know, issues escalated to them. And in the guidance that that Jonathan referred to earlier, and I did, what we talk about is also the supportive role that those three positions can have. You know, so very often what we would expect to see is, you know, senior, credible people in those roles that are experienced. Where we may see failings is where you get, not necessarily always negative, but where you don't have stability in those roles, or you've got lots of interims or lots of kind of changes that are happening. So I think what happens in those roles can be a bit of a measure and a bit of a signal of how good the governance is in an organisation. I think what you don't want to do though, and I'm sure you're not making this point, is that you see them as being the owners and accountable for it. I think what happens then is it will ask the leader's responsibility. So, you know, what you want to get to is a point where standards are set, are upheld, are modelled, problems solved, issues dealt with within, you know, statutory roles, but the whole organisation, every member of staff understands and is, you know, operating in an ethical way day to day. And I think that's where the system works at its best, where you've got that balance.
And Jonathan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Jacqui's expressed what I wanted to say on that.
Thank you very much. Well, in which case I'll move off leadership, but I will come back to Jacqui, please, because I'd just like to give you the opportunity to bring out any particular issues that you've noted in your work with private sector companies who are delivering public services. I know that the organisation's done a lot of work around this. And so, you know, again, focusing on high standards, are you confident that private companies are delivering public services, who are delivering public services? Are you confident they're upholding the Nolan Principles? That's a good start of a 10, I think.
Yeah, I would say some, well, as you get in every sector, I'd say some are. Some have seen that it is the way that you now have to do business if you are going to get trust with your customers, trust with your clients, trust with investors, employees. You know, it's absolutely fundamental to how you need to operate. And I think we're seeing some examples, and NG was one I mentioned earlier. I think Skanska, another construction company, have done some great work here. I think what you sometimes get, and Jonathan talked about 1990s, is, you know, we've still got a bit of a CSR, you know, corporate social responsibility. Oh, yeah. It's something that, you know, we do it because it's a good thing to do, and that applies to ethical standards as well, and a bit of a compliance element to it. So I'm not sure it's widespread. I'm not sure we have a common language yet across public services. I think the other element for me is around, there's something about the levers that we have within the system in order to not necessarily make these organisations vote on ethical behaviours, but from a commissioning point of view, we have levers which are around who gets work from government, who gets work from local councils. It still feels like ethical and high business standards is a secondary consideration behind other elements. And, I'm not sure yet whether we're using those levers as effectively as we can do. It still feels a bit voluntary code-ish, a bit. It would be great if you could be doing this, but we're not going to either not award you a contract on the back of it or reward you on a contract. So, I think there's some things that we can do just to help push things along a bit.
So where would you start? What should we do first to start to encourage that?
Well, I mean, we're looking at we're looking at Green Book now. We're looking at construction playbook. Oh, sorry, was that?
Yes, Jacqui, I was sticking with you. I'll come to you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, I think we're looking at the construction playbook. We're looking at the Green Book now. We're looking at procurement across. There's a whole kind of raft of things that I think sits with government as one of the biggest spenders, and then we can look to apply similar to the way we have around social value. There's a momentum there that I think we can be looking at, but also looking at what are the penalties around not having high ethical standards? We've got some very clear penalties around prompt payments now. It feels a bit opaque when it comes to ethical standards, and I think there could be some more clarity that we provide there.
Thank you. Sorry, Jonathan.
Two brief comments. One,
sure.
In bidding for, when looking at outsourcing contracts as a lawyer, and indeed when competing for work from the public sector on framework agreements, I'm asked far more about my data protection policies than I am about our adherence to high standards. But I think there is an opportunity. The government's green paper on public procurement suggests not only a more flexible approach, but a more value-driven approach to some of the awarding of some of the largest contracts in the public sector, and that would seem to be an ideal moment to embed within public procurement a more one which more explicitly requires adherence to ethical values.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that's all for me. I think Andrew, it is time to move on to you.
That's it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the contributions you've made so far. You've very much covered the area of local government, but there's an obvious gap in how we relate leadership in the political sphere with leadership in the organizational and service delivery sphere. And you've quite rightly pointed out that there can be problems with the political process. I guess as the member of the panel here today who is actually a politician, I ought to put in a word for local democracy and say that it's better than local administration when we try it. However, that having been said, would you perhaps like to say something about how best to manage ethical standards in a political environment, bearing in mind the very varied political environments of local authorities of all sorts? Jacqui, would you like to take that away?
Yes, yeah, and hopefully I haven't given any impression that we're not massive fans of local politics and democratic decision making. I think it's a fantastic system. Yeah, we're very mindful, and when we did our work, one of the characteristics is around political dynamics, because I think what we found over a period of time where resources in local government have diminished is actually very often in organisations where quite junior managers would go up in front of a scrutiny committee or be asked to go to cabinet and present a report. We're getting much less exposure. I think, interestingly, the last year around online meetings may have helped with that. So I think we're getting much less exposure to political dynamics, which means sometimes what happens is some of the kinds of robustness of how politics works through can be seen as, you know, not the way that we do things around here. And I'm not talking about bad behaviour, you know, this isn't about, but some of the kind of debate, you know, disagreement, how politicians reach consensus is something that organisations and individuals are not as exposed to. So I think there is something about how do we get across to officers and, you know, sometimes senior officers, the way that politics works and the way that kind of things work. I think where we see things working not as well is where that kind of political dynamic doesn't feel like it's managed as well for the benefit of the organisation. And I used an example before around, you know, sometimes what you can get is the kind of group dynamic of how, you know, party discipline is organised, decisions are made, you know, your world of, you know, how you organise things can become a dominant force within an organisation. And what we've found is where that can be the dominant force, we start to get a bit less transparency sometimes and a bit less of that kind of openness of decision making, as I talked about. What we've also seen over the last couple of years with more independent politicians is trying to navigate a system where we don't have the usual rules of political and party discipline in place. And how does that then start to work with this very rigid system of this is the way we make decisions around here, and we're going to presume you'll whip people or you will have talked about it. So we're just trying to manage some of that dynamic, I think, can be quite interesting. And then I think the final element, which we've talked about, is around sanctions. And, you know, the lack of kind of effective sanctions where behaviour isn't well managed, or, you know, and I think we've seen some examples of that over the last couple of years. And I think that's something that maybe we can have a think about. And I know government is considering your recommendations around that. You know, is the code of conduct effective enough? Is it going to be applied if we don't feel like there's effective sanctions, and what's the consequences of that from a political and democratic decision making?
Yes, well, our committee's report did very much reflect on that, of course, as you've just referenced. I'm very strongly tempted to get into a long debate about this, but I won't.
You can have a separate review on this one.
I used to give talks to potential group leaders about how they should lead their group, so I better just skate over all of that. But you've made an interesting point that actually, from the point of view of the officer corps, it's easier if you have got the dynamics of a group rather than the dynamics of 40 independents. And what about political structures as vehicles for delivering ethics and high standards? Perhaps you'd like to comment on that, and then if Jonathan's got something to add after that, by all means. Jacqui.
Yeah. I think we picked up on this earlier around, you know, do the Nolan Principles apply equally, and what leadership responsibilities do we expect from definitely, you know, people in leadership positions in political setups, but also all elected members. And we've worked with organisations where the governance failings around lack of trust, around perception of not being listened to, have very much come from the member side, which will be, you know, we've escalated either something around behaviour, we've escalated a problem or a concern, it goes into a group structure and doesn't feel like it's been effectively dealt with. So I think there's probably the two sides there. One is the leadership role modelling, upholding of behaviours and standards absolutely applies to members, and particularly those in elected positions. But also we just need that kind of trust and confidence that when standards are not being upheld, that they'll be dealt with either through group discipline if that's where it needs to be, or if not, between, across the wider system.
Okay, so do you think that central government sets the tone for local government, or can we get one right without the other?
I definitely think we can get one right without the other, and we shouldn't probably wait for one aspect. We need to move with the fastest rather than with the slowest on this. And I think the code of conduct particularly, and whatever work comes out of that, I think there's a real opportunity to set some standards there.
Jonathan?
Well, in trying to implement, I've been working on the model code of conduct for the Local Government Association, which came out of the recommendation from the committee's 2019 report. And that's caused me to reflect on the question along the lines of whose code is it anyway? Is it a code for councillors? Is it a code for officers? Or is it a code for the public? And actually, I think it's a code for all of those bodies, people. And I think it's been a particular success in terms of asking the LGA to become engaged on a model code of conduct, and their position and their engagement and their interest has shown huge strides since perhaps the position in 2011. However, I think there is a degree of concern that something coming from the LGA is from their particular perspective of politicians. And is it a good idea to have politicians writing the rules that govern politicians? And so there are a whole plethora of bodies, Local Government Association, Lawyers and Local Government, Police, National Association of Local Councils, Society of Local Council Clerks, and ADSO, all involved and all with an interest in the local government model code. They all have different interests and perspective, and that's tremendously healthy. But I do wonder whether it's sustainable to expect this group of lots of different people to come together consistently over a long period of time to not only draft a model code, but to maintain it and revise it. In 2019, I was not urging for the Standards Board for England to be recreated, but I do feel that England lacks a cheerleader for local government ethical standards and a code of conduct, in the way that in Scotland, the Standards Commission for Scotland does, I think, play that cheerleader role of advising and advocating on behalf of its code, which is common to a whole range of bodies, not just local authorities. And I sense that England, perhaps there is a vacuum there which needs to be addressed.
I see you nodding, Jacqui.
We've been one of the cheerleaders on the side of that very big group of people as well. So yeah, I agree with Jonathan. I think that there's been some really good strides, and the conversation happening and the role of the Ombudsman and all of that as well. But it's also something I think that we need to also make some decisions on. As you said before, someone's got to lead the way here. And either we settle for the situation as it is, or we drive forward. And I think there's an opportunity that we could miss here if we don't take some action around sanctions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. That's me finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can I say a very big thank you to Jacqui and to Jonathan for giving evidence today. It's been extremely helpful from our point of view, and we will ponder upon it.